7 words glowed on the cracked screen of a burner phone, meant for untraceable hits. "He's beating my mama. Please help us." Cassian stared at the pixelated text. He was a man who ordered executions before his morning espresso. He crushed bones and dismantled lives for a living. He didn't do rescues. Yet he typed a reply anyway, his thumbs thick and scarred over the cheap plastic keys. "I'm on my way." What happens when a ruthless syndicate boss becomes the only lifeline for a terrified 6-year-old? Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cassian Moretti's office, distorting the city lights into angry, bleeding streaks of neon red and sickly yellow. The room smelled of expensive, aged leather, stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of cold coffee. Cassian sat behind a massive slab of reclaimed mahogany, pinching the bridge of his nose. A dull, throbbing headache had nested behind his left eye since noon. He was 34, but he felt closer to 50. The modern reality of running a criminal syndicate was less about back-alley shootouts and far more about deciphering laundered tax brackets, managing bloated payrolls, and dealing with the bruised egos of middle-management thugs who thought they were movie stars. He reached for his glass of scotch, ignoring the condensation that dripped onto the paperwork. As he brought the rim to his lips, a harsh, synthetic buzzing vibrated against the wood. Cassian paused. It wasn't his sleek, encrypted smartphone. It was a heavy, archaic piece of plastic sitting in his bottom desk drawer. A burner. It belonged to a low-level smuggling broker named Tommy, who had taken a bullet to the neck 3 weeks prior. Cassian had kept the phone meaning to hand it off to his tech guy to scrub for loose ends, but it had slipped his mind beneath a mountain of supply chain logistics. The buzzing stopped, then started again. A text message. Setting the glass down, Cassian pulled open the drawer. The hinges squeaked slightly. He picked up the phone. The plastic felt cheap and oily against his calloused palm. He pressed the unlocking sequence, expecting a scrambled threat from a rival crew or a panicked message from one of Tommy's leftover junkies. Instead, the tiny monochrome screen lit up with a single unpunctuated line, "Here's beating my mama. Please help us." Cassian didn't blink. He stared at the glowing green pixels. His first instinct was sheer cold logic. It was a wrong number, a misdial, a tragic error in an indifferent universe. He should toss the phone into the wastebasket and pour another drink. He was not a savior. He was the disease this city suffered from. He had authorized the breaking of fingers, the burning of warehouses, and the quiet disappearances of men who owed him money. He had no business answering a child's prayer, yet a strange, suffocating tightness gripped his chest. He ran a thumb over the cracked plastic screen. The text felt raw. It didn't belong in his world of calculated risks and profit margins. It was messy. It was desperate. It was a raw nerve exposed in the dark. A second text vibrated into existence, nearly making him drop the device. "He locked me in the closet." "It hurts her." Cassian's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck pulled taut. He didn't experience a heroic epiphany. There was no swelling music in his head. Instead, what rose up inside him was a sudden, violent itch, a deeply ingrained predatory agitation. He hated the messy, chaotic violence of domestic squalor. He hated the cowards who perpetuated it. It reminded him of smells he had spent 20 years trying to scrub from his memory, the smell of cheap, stale beer, dirty carpets and copper. Before his brain could fully process the tactical absurdity of his actions, his scarred thumbs were moving over the rigid keypad. "I'm on my way. Don't make a sound." He hit send. He didn't know why. He didn't care to psychoanalyze himself in the moment. He pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Rocco!" Cassian barked his voice, a low, gravelly rasp that demanded immediate compliance. "Yeah, boss." The voice crackled back through the speaker. I need a trace on the burner Tommy had. I just got a ping. Find the GPS coordinates right now. Give me 2 minutes, Rocco said, the sound of rapid typing already echoing in the background. Cassian stood up. The joints in his knees popped in the quiet room. He walked over to the heavy oak coat rack and pulled down his dark wool trench coat. The fabric was heavy, holding the damp chill of the city. He checked the weight of the matte black pistol holstered at his hip. It was a comforting, familiar pressure. He didn't expect to need it, but he never left the building without it. The intercom buzzed. "Got it," Rocco said. "It's an apartment complex out in the East End, the rusted ones by the old textile plant. Unit 4B, judging by the altitude triangulation. You sending a crew to clean up a loose end?" "No," Cassian said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I'm going alone. Boss, it's pouring out there, and that's neutral territory." "Just have the car running out front, Rocco." Cassian killed the intercom. He walked out of his office, his heavy footsteps muffled by the plush hallway carpet. The descent in the private elevator was silent and agonizingly slow. By the time he reached the underground garage, his blood was humming. The polished black Audi was idling its headlights, cutting through the dim exhaust fumes. Cassian slid into the driver's seat, ignoring his driver, who stood holding an umbrella with a confused expression. He pulled the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside the soundproofed cabin. The smell of expensive leather polish and gasoline filled his lungs. He shifted into drive and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires squealed against the slick concrete as he surged up the ramp and exploded into the rain-drenched streets. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, rhythmic tempo. Cassian's grip on the steering wheel was tight enough to turn his knuckles white. He wasn't a white knight, but tonight somebody was going to bleed, and he intended to be the one holding the blade. Gravel crunched sickeningly under the Audi's tires as Cassian pulled into the crumbling parking lot of the East End complex. The structure looked like a rotting tooth against the night sky. Missing shingles, water-stained brickwork, and the flickering, sickly hum of a dying halogen street lamp cast long, distorted shadows. The rain was coming down in sheets, now soaking through Cassian's wool coat the second he stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't bother locking the car. He walked toward the main entrance, his expensive Italian leather shoes sinking into muddy puddles. The glass on the front door was completely shattered, leaving a jagged frame. Cassian stepped through it. The immediate smell hit him like a physical blow, boiled, cabbage-damp rotting carpet, and the sharp, unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies and cheap cigarettes. It was the scent of poverty and despair. He took the stairs 2 at a time, avoiding the broken steps. His breathing remained even steady. This was a hunt, 4th floor. The hallway lighting was dim, casting everything in a jaundiced yellow hue. The walls were scarred with graffiti and peeling paint. Cassian moved silently despite his size. He didn't need to check the numbers on the doors. He could hear it. From the end of the hall, muffled shouts bled through the thin drywall. A man's voice, slurred and heavy with rage. A woman's voice, crying, pleading. Then the sharp, wet sound of flesh hitting flesh. A heavy thud followed, vibrating through the floorboards under Cassian's feet. He reached Unit 4B. The door was flimsy, hollow core wood, probably kicked in a dozen times before, and poorly repaired with cheap screws. Cassian didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He raised his right leg and drove his heel directly into the space just beside the doorknob. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. The door burst inward, tearing the deadbolt right out of the rotting doorframe. Cassian stepped into the apartment. The sensory overload was immediate. A television was blaring a late-night infomercial casting blue light over a destroyed living room. Magazines, broken plates, and beer cans littered the sticky linoleum floor. In the center of the room stood a man, Jared. He was tall, thick around the middle, wearing a stained white undershirt and torn jeans. His knuckles were raw. standing over a woman who was curled into a protective ball on the floor. Nora. She had one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other covering her face. Her breathing was ragged, panicked. Blood was welling from a split lip, mixing with tears and smearing across her pale cheek. Jared spun around, his bloodshot eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and drunken fury. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred, taking a belligerent step forward. "Get out of my house." Cassian didn't say a word. He didn't grandstand. He didn't give a monologue. He simply closed the distance between them in two massive, terrifyingly fast strides. Jared barely had time to raise his hands before Cassian's fist connected with his jaw. It wasn't a sporting punch. It was a strike designed to end a fight instantly. The sound of the impact was dull and sickening, like a meat cleaver hitting a butcher's block. Jared's eyes rolled back. His knees buckled instantly, his heavy frame collapsing backward into a cheap glass coffee table. The glass shattered outward in a violent spray, but Jared didn't even twitch. He lay motionless in the ruins of the table, out cold. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, save for the droning television. Cassian stood over the unconscious man, his chest barely heaving. He slowly uncurled his fist, feeling the slight sting in his knuckles. He wiped a drop of the man's blood from his cuff. Then he turned his attention to the woman on the floor. Nora hadn't moved to thank him. She hadn't swooned into his arms. Instead, she had scrambled backward like a trapped animal, pressing her spine against the dirty baseboards. Her eyes, wide and dilated with sheer terror, were locked onto Cassian. Her hand was blindly groping the floor until her fingers curled around a jagged piece of the broken coffee table glass. She held it up her hand, shaking violently. She wasn't looking at a savior. She was looking at a predator who had just effortlessly dismantled the monster she feared most. Cassian stood 6'2", draped in a heavy soaked trench coat, his face cast in cold, unreadable lines. He smelled of rain ozone and impending violence. "Stay back," Nora choked out her voice, a ragged, breathless whisper. "I swear to God, stay away from me." Cassian froze. The internal contradiction hit him again, a sharp ache beneath his ribs. He was terrifying her. He knew how to break men, how to intimidate, how to extract information. He didn't know how to soften his edges. Slowly, deliberately, he raised both hands, keeping his palms open and visible. "Put the glass down," he said, forcing his gravelly voice to be as quiet and even as possible. "Who are you?" she demanded, a sob catching in her throat. Before Cassian could answer, a small, tentative scraping sound came from the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. Cassian shifted his gaze. The louvered door of a small utility closet slowly pushed open. A little girl no older than 6 crept out. Her hair was tangled, her face smeared with dust and tears. In her tiny, trembling hands, she clutched the black plastic burner phone. She looked at the unconscious man on the floor, then at her bleeding mother, and finally up at the towering man in the dark coat. "Are you the man from the phone?" Lily asked, her voice squeaking impossibly small in the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room. Cassian looked down at the child. He felt the cold, hard weight of the gun against his hip, a stark reminder of the violent world he inhabited. He looked back at Nora, whose grip on the glass shard was faltering as she stared in confusion at her daughter. "Yeah," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He slowly lowered his hands, feeling utterly out of his depth. "I'm the man from the phone. Get your coats. We're leaving." Glass crunched beneath Nora's worn sneakers as she finally lowered the jagged shard. Her arm shook so violently she nearly dropped it on her own foot. She didn't trust the massive man occupying her destroyed living room. He didn't look like police. He didn't look like a social worker. He looked like the kind of violence that usually operated in the shadows, not under the buzzing fluorescent light of a cheap apartment. "Get your coats," Cassian repeated. His voice wasn't a suggestion. It was an industrial press, heavy and unyielding. Nora didn't move to pack a bag. She didn't gather heirlooms or photographs. Survival instinct honed by years of walking on eggshells around Jared overrode sentimentality. She grabbed a faded pink parka from the floor, shaking off shards of the coffee table, and shoved Lily's small arms into the sleeves. She found her own denim jacket draped over a dining chair. That was it. No suitcases, no toothbrush. Cassian watched them. He noted the bruise darkening on Nora's jaw, the way she favored her left side, protecting ribs that were likely cracked. He felt that predatory itch again, a low-frequency hum in his blood. He glanced at Jared, who was still bleeding quietly into the ruined carpet. A part of Cassian wanted to wake the man up, just to break his jaw a second time properly this time, so it would never wire shut right. He suppressed the urge. It was sloppy. "Walk in front of me," Cassian instructed, gesturing toward the splintered doorframe with a nod of his chin. Nora scooped Lily into her arms, groaning softly, as the child's weight pressed against her bruised ribs. She practically sprinted past Cassian, her shoulder brushing his wet wool coat. She flinched at the contact. Cassian smelled it then, the sharp, acrid scent of sour sweat and raw adrenaline radiating off her. They moved down the stairwell in silence. The air grew colder, the stench of the building giving way to the smell of rain and wet asphalt. When they reached the shattered front doors, the storm was still raging. Cassian stepped past them, pushing the broken glass aside with a leather-gloved hand. "The black car," he said, pointing to the idling Audi. Nora hesitated on the curb. The rain instantly plastered her thin hair to her skull. She looked at the luxury vehicle, then at the desolate street, and finally at Cassian. Her mind was a frantic abacus, calculating risks. Getting into a car with a stranger who hit like a freight train was a gamble. But staying here meant Jared would wake up. She opened the heavy rear door and climbed in, pulling Lily onto her lap. The door shut with a solid hermetic thud, instantly cutting off the roar of the rain. Cassian slid into the driver's seat. He didn't look back at them. He shifted in to drive his heavy boot, pressing the pedal, and the Audi glided away from the curb. The interior of the car was a sensory shock to Nora. It was stiflingly quiet. The air smelled of expensive leather conditioner and a faint trace of peppermint. The heater blasted warm, dry air, slowly thawing the damp chill seeping into her bones. She held Lily tight against her chest. The little girl was eerily silent, her face buried in Nora's damp denim jacket. Cassian drove with a mechanical precision. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the slick roads, the rearview mirror, the side streets. He was running counter-surveillance out of pure habit. He took a convoluted route, doubling back through the industrial district, crossing the bridge, and winding through the narrow, cobbled streets of the old merchant quarter. In the back seat, Nora watched the back of his head. His dark hair was neatly cropped at the sides, wet from the rain. His shoulders were broad enough to obscure her view of the windshield. "Where are you taking us?" Nora asked. Her voice cracked, betraying the veneer of composure she was trying to maintain. "Somewhere he can't find you." Cassian replied, his tone devoid of warmth. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't tell her everything was going to be fine. He dealt in facts, and the fact was, she was sitting in a car with a man who ran a third of the city's illicit ports. "You shouldn't have done that," Nora whispered, staring out the window at the blurred streetlights. "Jared, he knows people. Bad people. He runs numbers for the local crews out in the East End." Cassian let out a sound that was half scoff, half exhale. "I'm sure he does. He'll come looking for us. He'll come looking for you." Cassian glanced at the rearview mirror, making brief, intense eye contact with Nora's reflection. His eyes were dark, hollow, and utterly devoid of fear. "Let him look," Cassian said quietly. "He'll find out quickly enough that he doesn't know what bad people actually look like." The absolute certainty in his voice made Nora's stomach plummet. The realization hit her cold and heavy. Jared was a violent drunk who beat his wife. The man driving this car was something entirely different. He was an apex predator, and she had just buckled herself and her daughter into his cage. Tires hissed over the slick concrete as the Audi descended into the subterranean parking garage of a high-rise in the financial district. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sterile white glare over the hood of the car. Cassian pulled into a reserved, oversized spot between two concrete pillars and cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was suffocating. Cassian sat still for a fraction of a second, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He was acutely aware of the absurdity of his situation. He was supposed to be reviewing the ledger for a hijacked shipment of industrial solvents. Instead, he had a battered woman and a 6-year-old girl in his back seat. If his underboss, Silas, he didn't use that name anymore, his underboss Vincenzo found out he was playing social worker, the syndicate would see it as a weakness. A crack in the armor. In his world, weakness was an invitation for a coup. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "We're here. Take the private elevator. It goes straight up." Nora didn't argue. She was exhausted, running on the fumes of an adrenaline crash. She unbuckled Lily, who had fallen into a deep, trauma-induced sleep, and hoisted the girl onto her hip. Cassian opened his door and stepped out, the cool, damp air of the garage clinging to his clothes. He walked around the car and opened Nora's door, stepping back to give her space. He keyed a fob, and a set of heavy steel doors slid open against the back wall of the garage. The elevator interior was paneled in dark walnut and brushed steel. Nora stepped in, clutching her daughter. Cassian followed, standing rigidly in the opposite corner. As the elevator ascended, the pressure popped in Nora's ears. When the doors opened, they stepped directly into the foyer of a sprawling penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm-battered city skyline. The floors were polished concrete, covered in plush, abstract rugs. The furniture was minimalist, sharp-edged, and expensive. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end waiting room for a very exclusive purgatory. "Put her on the couch," Cassian said, shrugging off his heavy wet coat and hanging it on a sleek metal rack. Nora gently laid Lily down on a sprawling slate-grey sectional. The leather was soft, giving way beneath the child's weight. Nora pulled a cashmere throw from the back of the sofa and draped it over her daughter. Only then did she turn to face her host. Cassian was walking toward a modern kitchen island. He opened a drawer, pulled out a heavy white box marked with a red cross, and set it on the marble counter. "Come here," he said, opening the box. Nora hesitated. She wrapped her arms around her own torso, her fingers digging into the denim of her jacket. "I'm fine." Cassian looked up. His face was a mask of tired annoyance. "Your lip is split open, you have a contusion forming on your cheekbone, and you're guarding your left side like your ribs are fractured. You are objectively not fine. Come here." The blunt clinical assessment left no room for argument. Nora slowly crossed the room, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She stopped on the opposite side of the kitchen island, treating it like a physical barricade. Cassian pulled out a bottle of antiseptic, a stack of gauze pads, and a small roll of medical tape. He unscrewed the cap, the harsh, sterile smell of the alcohol, instantly overpowering the faint scent of rain and money in the apartment. He saturated a square of gauze. He reached across the counter. Nora flinched violently, her eyes squeezing shut, her shoulders hiking up to her ears in an automatic defensive posture. Cassian froze. His hand hovered in the air inches from her face. His jaw tightened. He had seen men beg for their lives, seen them weep and soil themselves in fear, and it had never moved him. But the way this woman braced herself for a blow he had no intention of delivering made his chest burn with a sudden, localized fury. He slowly lowered his hand, placing the soaked gauze on the marble counter. "Do it yourself," he said, his voice flat, retreating back into his cold, professional shell. "It's going to sting." Nora opened her eyes. She looked at the gauze, then up at Cassian. His face was unreadable, but he had taken a deliberate half-step back, giving her space. Her hand trembled as she picked up the white square and pressed it against her split lip. She hissed sharply through her teeth as the alcohol bit into the torn flesh. Cassian watched her, leaning his hips against the counter. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow I'll have someone arrange cash and a car. You can leave the city. Go somewhere he won't look." Nora wiped the blood from her chin, tossing the red-stained gauze into a sleek, stainless steel trash can. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice raspy. "You don't know us. That text, it was an accident." Cassian looked over at the couch where Lily was sleeping soundly, the burner phone still clutched in her small, relaxed fist. "I know," Cassian said quietly. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain the burner phone, or Tommy the dead smuggler, or the syndicate. He pushed a small amber bottle of painkillers across the counter. "Take 2 of these for your ribs. Lock the bedroom door if it makes you feel better. I'll be in the study." He turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing in the cavernous apartment, leaving Nora standing alone in a pristine kitchen, trading the devil she knew for a demon she didn't. Morning arrived not with the gentle trill of birdsong, but with the harsh, blinding glare of sunlight reflecting off the glass facades of neighboring skyscrapers. Nora woke with a sharp gasp. Her left side seized a hot, stabbing pain radiating from her ribs down to her hip. She squeezed her eyes shut, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. She was still on the slate-grey sectional. The cashmere throw was tangled around her legs. Lily was a warm, heavy weight against her right side, her breathing deep and even. Nora slowly opened her eyes. The penthouse was terrifyingly quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows looking washed out and raw. She carefully pushed herself up into a sitting position, favoring her uninjured side. The movement sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She touched her face. Her lower lip was swollen, the split flesh sealed with a crust of dried blood. A deep, tender ache throbbed beneath her left eye. The sharp, bitter scent of espresso drifted into the living area, cutting through the sterile, metallic smell of the air conditioning. Nora turned her head. Cassian was in the kitchen. He was no longer wearing the heavy wool coat or the dark suit jacket. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with dense muscle and faded, jagged scars that looked too violent to be accidents. He was leaning against the marble island, holding a tiny, delicate ceramic cup between his thick fingers. He was staring out the window, his expression utterly blank. He didn't look like a savior in the daylight. Without the shadows and the rain to soften his edges, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who survived by being harder and more ruthless than his environment. The stark morning light caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the cold, flat slate of his eyes. "There's water in the fridge," Cassian said, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that broke the silence. He didn't turn to look at her. He had tracked her waking movements purely by the sound of the leather couch shifting. "Take the other 2 pills. I called a guy. He's bringing a clean car and an envelope of cash in an hour. You're going upstate." Nora's chest tightened. She gently slid her arm out from under Lily, resting the child's head on a decorative pillow. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly as her feet hit the cold, polished concrete floor. She walked toward the kitchen, wrapping her arms around her waist. "Upstate," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "I don't know anyone upstate." "That's the point," Cassian said, finally turning to face her. He set the espresso cup down with a soft click. "Jared knows the East End. He knows the bars, the pawn shops, the train stations. He doesn't know the Catskills. You take the car, you drive north, you rent a quiet place, and you don't look back." It was perfectly logical. It was a clean, efficient solution to a messy problem. But Nora felt a sudden, irrational spike of panic. For 6 years, her entire world had shrunk to the size of a rotting apartment, and the unpredictable moods of a violent drunk. The idea of a void, a massive unknown space filled with strangers, terrified her almost as much as Jared did. Before she could form a reply, a soft rustling came from the living room. Lily was sitting up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes with tiny fists. She looked around the massive, intimidating room, her gaze finally landing on Cassian in the kitchen. She didn't cry. She didn't shrink back. She slid off the couch, her bare feet pattering softly against the concrete, and walked straight up to the marble island. She had to tilt her head back, as far as it would go, to look at Cassian's face. "I'm hungry," Lily stated, her voice thick with sleep. Cassian froze. The cold, calculated syndicate boss, a man who orchestrated hostile takeovers and supply chain monopolies, stared at the 6-year-old girl in the oversized pink parka as if she had just demanded he recite quantum physics in Aramaic. He looked at Nora, a rare flash of genuine helplessness crossing his features. "I don't—" Cassian started, his voice losing its authoritative edge. He looked at the sleek, minimalist appliances. "I don't cook. I have espresso and scotch." "She can't have espresso," Nora said, a bizarre, hysterical bubble of laughter threatening to burst in her throat. The sheer absurdity of the situation was finally cracking her fractured nerves. Cassian frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He opened a massive stainless steel refrigerator. It contained 2 bottles of imported sparkling water, a half-empty jar of Dijon mustard, and a plastic container of what looked like dry-aged ribeye. He closed it with a sigh. "I'll order something," Cassian muttered, pulling his phone from his pocket. Before he could unlock the screen, the private elevator chimed. Cassian's posture changed instantly. The awkward, hesitant man vanished, replaced by a coiled spring. His hand dropped instinctively to the waistband of his trousers, resting just above the grip of his holstered pistol. He stepped in front of Nora and Lily, using his broad shoulders to physically shield them from the foyer. The heavy steel doors slid open. A man stepped out. He was leaner than Cassian, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and a silk tie. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. This was Vincenzo. Vincenzo stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from Cassian's defensive posture to the bruised woman and the small child huddled behind him. The air in the penthouse instantly dropped 10 degrees. "Boss," Vincenzo said, his voice smooth, but layered with immediate, dangerous tension. "We have a problem." Cassian didn't relax his stance. His thumb remained hooked casually over his belt, inches from the gun. "You don't have clearance for the private lift, Vincenzo. I told you to buzz up." Vincenzo's eyes flickered toward Nora again, assessing the bruised jaw and the defensive way she was pulling the child against her legs. He didn't ask questions. Syndicate survival rule number 1, never ask the boss about a civilian unless explicitly instructed to. The concierge didn't stop me because the lobby is currently hosting 2 detectives from the 4th precinct, Vincenzo said, stepping further into the foyer, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the rugs. "I bypassed them through the service garage. I figured you'd want to know immediately." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Detectives, they aren't here for the waterfront zoning permits," Vincenzo said dryly. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his breast pocket, realized where he was, and shoved it back in his fingers, drumming nervously against his thigh. They're asking about a black Audi. More specifically, they're asking if anyone saw an Audi leaving the East End last night. Nora's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on Lily's hand. Her mind raced violently, pulling her back to the smell of damp carpet and cheap beer. Jared. Jared called the cops. Nora whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. He never calls the cops. He has warrants. Vincenzo finally looked directly at her. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her words. Your husband didn't call the cops, ma'am. He's currently wired shut in the ICU at St. Jude's. A neighbor called it in. But that's not the problem. He turned his attention back to Cassian. The problem is that Jared is a runner for Sullivan's crew, and Sullivan is telling the cops that a rival syndicate hit his territory last night. He's using the police to flush you out. Cassian let out a low, dangerous breath. The sound was closer to a growl. He stepped away from the kitchen island, closing the distance between himself and his underboss. Sullivan is a bottom feeder. Cassian said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a menacing, resonant quality that made the hair on Nora's arms stand up. He runs scrap metal and low-rent loan sharks. He doesn't dictate terms to me. He doesn't know it was you, Cassian, Vincenzo urged, his tone dropping the formal boss in the face of the escalating crisis. He just knows a massive guy in a tailored coat kicked a door off its hinges and nearly decapitated one of his earners. But he's got eyes on the toll bridges and the train stations. He's looking for the car, and he's looking for the woman. If you send her out right now, with or without a clean car, Sullivan's guys will spot her before she hits the county line. The room spun. Nora braced her hand against the cold marble of the kitchen island. The pristine Billionaire sanctuary suddenly felt like a steel cage. She had traded a violent drunk for a gang war. I can't stay here, Nora said, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of hysteria. If they find us here, they'll kill him. They'll kill my daughter. I have to go. She turned, grabbing Lily's parka, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to move. Stop, Cassian commanded. He didn't raise his voice, but the word hit the air with the physical force of a slamming door. Nora froze her back to him, her shoulders shaking violently. Cassian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the predatory instinct that told him to lock down the room and assert absolute control. He forced himself to exhale slowly. He walked up behind her. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to touch a trapped, terrified animal, but he stood close enough that his imposing presence blocked the exit. You walk out that door, Sullivan's men will have you in the back of a van before noon. Cassian said, his voice stripping away any pretense of comfort. He was giving her the raw, ugly truth. They don't want you. They want to use you as bait to find out who insulted their boss. Do you understand what that means? Nora turned around slowly. Her eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries broken from a night of silent, agonizing crying. She looked up at the towering, scarred man. Who are you? She breathed the question, carrying the weight of sheer, unadulterated dread. What kind of business are you in? Cassian looked down at her. He didn't look away from her bruised face. He felt a twisted dark knot tighten in his gut. He hated the fear in her eyes, but he couldn't lie to her. Not now. I'm the kind of man your husband wishes he was, and the kind of man he's terrified of. Cassian said the words cold and precise. I run the ports, I run the unions, and I crush people like Sullivan before breakfast. Nora shrank back, pulling Lily behind her legs. You're a monster. Yes, Cassian agreed without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. I am. But right now I'm the monster, standing between you and the men who want to hurt you." He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto his underboss. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the chilling, calculating gaze of a syndicate warlord. "Vincenzo," Cassian said, the gravel in his voice hardening into granite. "Pull the crew. Empty the armory. We aren't hiding from a street-level thug." Vincenzo nodded, a grim, satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Where are we going, boss?" Cassian reached for his heavy wool coat, the fabric still slightly damp from the rain. He checked the magazine of his matte black pistol, the metallic clack echoing sharply in the quiet penthouse. "We're going to the East End," Cassian said softly. "We're going to teach Mr. Sullivan how to properly knock on a door." Heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing the penthouse in a vacuum of silence. Nora flinched at the heavy mechanical thud. The sudden absence of Cassian and Vincenzo left the massive apartment feeling too large, echoing with the ghost of their violent intent. She stood in the kitchen, her fingers curled so tightly around the edge of the marble island that her knuckles ached. Lily tugged at the hem of Nora's denim jacket. "Is the big man mad at us?" Nora swallowed hard. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "No, baby. He's not mad at us." She lied, or maybe she didn't. She had no idea what drove a man like Cassian Moretti. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. A man stepped into the living area, and Nora instinctively pulled Lily behind her. This man wasn't in a tailored suit. He wore dark cargo pants, a black thermal shirt, and a tactical vest. He looked younger than Cassian, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely bored. "Name's Carver," he said, his voice flat. He didn't offer a hand. He walked past them, heading straight for the refrigerator. "Boss said nobody comes up, nobody goes down. You need anything you ask. Otherwise, pretend I'm a piece of the furniture." Carver pulled out a loaf of bread and a block of butter that Nora hadn't noticed earlier. He dropped 2 slices into a sleek silver toaster. The mundane domestic act of making toast felt violently out of place with the heavy Glock strapped to his thigh. "Toast is for the kid," Carver mumbled, leaning his hip against the counter, his eyes scanning the windows overlooking the city. "You should sit down. You look like you're going to pass out, and I ain't catching you." Nora didn't argue. Her knees felt like water. She guided Lily back to the slate-grey sectional, the soft leather squeaking beneath their weight. The smell of toasting bread filled the air, replacing the sterile bite of the antiseptic. It was a normal smell. It made Nora want to sob uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands, her fingers digging into her scalp, fighting the tremor in her shoulders. She was trapped in a glass cage, suspended above the city, waiting to see if a warlord would return, or if a street thug would find her first. Miles away, the tires of a black armored SUV chewed up the pothole-riddled asphalt of the East End. Cassian sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked streets. The windshield wipers beat a steady, aggressive rhythm. Vincenzo drove in silence, his jaw tight. The back of the SUV held 4 men, heavily armed and vibrating with a quiet, lethal energy. The air inside the vehicle was heavy. It smelled of wet wool, damp leather, and the sharp, acidic tang of gun oil. Cassian stared at his own hands. They were resting on his thighs, relaxed, but he could feel the pulse beating steadily in his wrists. He was angry. It wasn't the hot, blinding rage of a bar brawl. It was a cold, calculated fury that turned his blood to ice water. Sullivan was a parasite. He ran a small-time scrap operation that fronted for chop shops and low-interest loan sharking. He wasn't a player. He was a nuisance. "Take the back alley behind the crushing yard." Cassian ordered, his voice a low gravel scrape against the hum of the engine. "Cut the headlights." Vincenzo nodded, turning the heavy wheel. The SUV plunged into complete darkness, navigating the narrow garbage-strewn alley by memory and moonlight. They rolled to a halt behind a towering wall of rusted, crushed car chassis. The smell of oxidized iron, stagnant puddles, and old motor oil seeped through the vents. "We going in loud?" Vincenzo asked, shifting the car into park. "No," Cassian said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Loud implies a fight. This isn't a fight. It's an eviction." Cassian stepped out into the drizzle. His heavy coat absorbed the dampness, adding weight to his shoulders. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The men behind him spilled out of the SUV, moving with practiced silent efficiency. They approached the corrugated metal door of Sullivan's office, a dilapidated trailer grafted onto the side of a rusted warehouse. Two men in dirty denim jackets stood under a flickering yellow bulb, smoking and laughing harshly. They were Sullivan's lookouts. Cassian didn't slow his pace. The lookouts noticed him a second too late. Before the first man could drop his cigarette and reach for his waistband, Vincenzo moved. A suppressed thwip cut through the sound of the rain, and the man's knee buckled as a 9mm round shattered his kneecap. The second man froze, his eyes going wide as 3 laser sights materialized on his chest. "Open the door," Cassian said to the standing man, his voice devoid of any inflection. The man's hands shook violently. He fumbled with the cheap brass knob and pushed the door inward. The stench of stale beer, cheap cigars, and burnt coffee rolled out into the damp air. Cassian stepped over the threshold. The office was cramped, the walls plastered with faded calendars and smeared grease. Behind a battered metal desk sat Sullivan. He was a bloated man with a ruddy complexion, wearing a track jacket that strained over his gut. He was mid-sentence, yelling into a desk phone when he looked up. The phone slipped from Sullivan's hand, clattering loudly against the linoleum. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, mottled grey. Moretti. Sullivan choked out his chair, squealing as he instinctively tried to push back, trapping himself against the cheap wood paneling of the wall. Cassian closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a vault sealing shut. Grease and stale beer masked the metallic tang of fear sweating out of Sullivan's pores. The bloated man didn't move. He barely breathed. He looked at Cassian, then past Cassian's shoulder to Vincenzo, who was leaning against the closed door, casually wiping rainwater from his brow. The armed men remained outside their presence, a suffocating weight pressing against the thin walls of the trailer. Cassian walked slowly toward the metal desk. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the desk or draw his gun. He simply pulled up a folding chair, the metal scraping harshly against the linoleum, and sat down directly across from Sullivan. "Cassian, look, I didn't know you were coming down to the East End," Sullivan stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. His palms were slick with sweat. "If this is about the shipping crates from last month, I told your guys the kickback is coming. We just had a slow week." "Shut up," Cassian said. The volume was low, but the command struck Sullivan like a physical blow. The man snapped his mouth shut, his jaw trembling. Cassian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. He stared directly into Sullivan's bloodshot eyes. "I don't care about your kickback, Sullivan. I don't care about your scrap metal, and I don't care about your pathetic little crew. What I care about is the fact that you have detectives asking questions about a black Audi." Sullivan blinked confusion, battling the sheer terror on his face. "The Audi. The guy from the apartment. The one who put Jared in the ICU. That was your car." "Jared is a wife-beating piece of trash," Cassian stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "He broke a coffee table with his face last night. He earned it. You, however, are currently earning something much worse. I didn't know." Sullivan's voice cracked, pitching upward into a pathetic whine. I swear to God, Cassian, I had no idea it was your operation. Jared just runs numbers for me. He's a nobody. The cops got called by a neighbor. I was just trying to figure out who hit my territory. I got a save face, you know." Cassian tilted his head slightly. The utter lack of empathy in his gaze was terrifying. "Save face? You're worried about your reputation in a zip code that smells like raw sewage." Cassian stood up. He moved with a sudden fluid speed that belied his massive frame. He grabbed Sullivan by the collar of his track jacket and violently yanked him halfway across the desk. Pencils and coffee mugs went flying, crashing to the floor. Sullivan choked his hands, scrabbling uselessly against Cassian's iron grip. "Listen to me very carefully," Cassian whispered, his face inches from Sullivan's sweating forehead. The smell of cheap aftershave and terrified breath hit him, but Cassian didn't flinch. "You're going to call off your search. You're going to tell the detectives that Jared got drunk, tripped down a flight of stairs and broke his own jaw. You're going to scrub the security footage from the toll cameras your boys tapped into. And if I ever hear that you or any of your men are looking for a woman named Nora or a little girl..." Cassian tightened his grip, twisting the fabric until it cut off Sullivan's airway. The man's face began to turn a deep, mottled purple. "I won't come back here with a crew." Cassian finished his voice, a lethal vibrating hum. "I will come back alone, and I will burn this scrapyard to the ground with you chained to the floorboards. Do you understand me?" Sullivan nodded frantically, his eyes bulging spit, bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Cassian let go. Sullivan collapsed back into his chair, gasping desperately for air, coughing violently as he clutched his bruised throat. Cassian didn't look back. He turned and walked to the door. Vincenzo opened it for him, stepping out into the cold drizzle. They walked back to the armored SUV in silence. The problem was handled. It was a brutal, ugly piece of business, the kind Cassian engaged in every day. Yet as he slid into the passenger seat and the engine roared to life, he didn't feel the usual cold satisfaction of maintaining order. He felt dirty. The drive back to the financial district was a blur of neon lights and smudged windshields. By the time the private elevator doors slid open in the penthouse, it was past midnight. The apartment was dark, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Carver was sitting in a chair near the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, nodded once, and quietly slipped out, taking the service elevator down. Cassian unbuttoned his coat and threw it over the metal rack. He smelled like gun oil rain and the metallic tang of the scrapyard. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jawline. He was exhausted. He walked toward the kitchen to pour a drink. As he passed the slate-grey sectional, he stopped. Nora was awake. She was sitting in the corner of the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, the cashmere throw wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Lily was asleep, sprawled out on the cushions, her head resting near Nora's hip. Nora didn't look terrified anymore. She looked hollowed out. The bruising on her face had darkened into a deep, ugly purple. Cassian stood there, the shadows clinging to his massive frame. He was a violent man, returning from a violent errand. He belonged in the dark. But looking at her holding her breath in the quiet of his home, he felt that strange, agonizing tightness in his chest again. "Is he coming?" Nora asked. Her voice was a fragile, papery whisper in the dark room. Cassian poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass. He didn't drink it. He stared at the amber liquid, swirling it gently. "No," Cassian said quietly, his voice lacking the sharp, commanding edge it usually carried. "He isn't coming. Sullivan called off his men. The police think it was a drunken accident. You're safe." Nora slowly lowered her knees. She didn't weep with relief. She didn't rush to thank him. She just stared at him, trying to reconcile the monster who broke jaws with the man who made sure her daughter had toast. What happens now? She asked, the vulnerability in her voice raw and jagged. Cassian looked up from his glass. His dark eyes met hers across the shadowy room. He had intended to send her away. He had the cash and the car ready. But looking at her now, he knew with a sickening certainty that if he put her in a car, he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for her. "I don't know," Cassian admitted, the words tasting foreign and heavy on his tongue. "But you aren't running anymore." Rain returned just before dawn, a fine, creeping mist that turned the towering glass windows into sheets of frosted grey. Cassian remained at the kitchen island. He hadn't slept. The glass of scotch sat untouched beside his right hand, the ice long melted into a tepid puddle. He listened to the quiet rhythm of the penthouse, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of the climate control, and the soft, measured breathing coming from the slate-grey sectional. He was a man accustomed to absolute control. He compartmentalized violence, profit, and risk into neat, manageable columns. The woman and child sleeping 20 feet away violated every operational security protocol he had ever established. Keeping them here was a tactical error. It gave his enemies a target. It gave his own men a reason to question his judgment. A soft rustle of fabric broke his train of thought. Nora was sitting up. The cashmere throw slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist. In the flat grey light of morning, the bruising on her face looked shockingly vibrant, angry shades of violet and sickly yellow spreading across her cheekbone and jaw. She winced, her hand instinctively flying to her ribs as she shifted her weight. She didn't look out at the city skyline. She looked straight at him. Cassian pushed away from the marble counter. The heavy soles of his boots made no sound as he crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from the edge of the rug, respecting the invisible boundary between his world and her fragile sanctuary. "You need ice for that jaw," Cassian said, his voice a low, rough murmur in the quiet room. Nora didn't move. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around her shins. "Last night you said we weren't running anymore. What does that actually mean?" Her voice lacked the hysterical edge of the previous day. It was hollowed out, scraped raw by exhaustion and adrenaline withdrawal. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking for parameters. She needed to know the shape of her new cage. Cassian shoved his hands into the pockets of his dark trousers. He felt the cold, hard metal of his spare magazine against his knuckles. He could lie. He could tell her it was out of the goodness of his heart that he was a reformed man playing the White Knight, but he respected the sheer survival instinct radiating off her too much to feed her garbage. "It means I don't like loose ends." Cassian stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "If I put you in a car and send you to a cabin in the Catskills, I have to put 2 of my men on you to make sure Sullivan didn't lie to me. If I put men on you, my underboss asks questions. The syndicate starts whispering. It's bad for business." Nora swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly. "So keeping us in your apartment is less conspicuous?" "No, it's infinitely more complicated." Cassian pulled a hand from his pocket and rubbed the back of his neck, a rare physical gesture of frustration. "But if you're here, I don't have to wonder if you're bleeding out in a ditch somewhere. I can see you. It's a selfish logistical decision." It was a harsh, ugly way to phrase it, but Nora's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She understood logistics. She understood transactional relationships. A man keeping her around because his own dark paranoia demanded it made more sense to her than a sudden burst of fairy tale altruism. "I don't have any money," she said quietly, her eyes dropping to the polished concrete floor. "I left my purse in the apartment. I don't have a phone. I can't pay you for—" She gestured vaguely at the sprawling luxury around them, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Cassian let out a short, humorless exhale that ruffled his dark shirt. If I cared about money, I would have let Sullivan keep his kickbacks. You aren't a tenant, Nora. Before the heavy silence could settle again, the cushion beside Nora shifted. Lily sat up, her hair a tangled bird's nest, her cheek creased from the leather sofa. She rubbed her eyes, looking blearily from her mother to the towering, scarred man standing in the center of the living room. She reached into the deep pocket of her oversized pink parka, which she had insisted on sleeping in. Her tiny hand emerged, clutching the black plastic burner phone. She slid off the couch, her bare feet pattering softly against the floor. She didn't hesitate. She walked right past the invisible boundary her mother had drawn and stopped directly in front of Cassian. She held the phone out, offering it up to him. "Mama says we shouldn't keep things that aren't ours," Lily said, her voice a tiny, sleep-thickened squeak in the cavernous room. Cassian looked down at the cheap, cracked device. The plastic casing was smeared with dirt and fingerprints. It was a piece of garbage meant for disposable crimes. Yet it felt impossibly heavy as he reached out and took it from her small hand. His thick, calloused fingers completely dwarfed the phone. He looked at the cracked screen. The text was gone, lost to the encrypted void, but the words were permanently burned into the back of his skull. "Is beating my mama. Please help us." He had answered a wrong number. In doing so, he had invited complete chaos into his violently ordered life. He looked at Lily, who was staring up at him with absolute, unearned trust, and then at Nora, who was watching him with a volatile mixture of lingering terror and a desperate, fragile hope. Cassian didn't hand the phone to his tech guy to be scrubbed. He didn't toss it in a drawer for a rainy day. He wrapped his massive fist around the plastic casing and squeezed. The cheap plastic groaned, then shattered with a sharp, violent crack. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 opaque shards, cutting into his palm. He ignored the sting, squeezing until the internal battery casing snapped, rendering the device entirely dead. He tossed the broken pieces onto a silver tray on the kitchen counter. The sound was harsh, metallic, and incredibly final. "You don't need it anymore," Cassian said, his dark eyes leaving the wreckage and locking onto Nora's. The cold, dead expression he wore for the syndicate was completely gone, replaced by something grounded, deeply imperfect, and dangerously human. "If you need someone, you don't have to text." Nora let out a shaky breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 years. She pulled the cashmere throw back up to her chin, the soft wool grounding her in the absolute present. She was living with a warlord. She was sleeping in the lion's den. But for the very first time in her life, the teeth were facing outward, guarding the door. Did that final scene give you chills? Cassian might be a monster to the underworld, but he just became the ultimate shield for Nora and Lily. If you loved this dark, gritty take on the Mafia romance genre, you have to smash that like button. Right now. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dive audio stories. Share this video with a friend who loves a morally grey hero, and drop a comment below. What do you think the syndicate will do when they find out Cassian is hiding a family? See you in the next one.